I think it's very difficult for us to have a conversation about Gen Z and Alpha without talking about the community aspect. I think that's something that they crave so much, and that's why gaming is their favorite thing to do. It's their favorite hobby. You get to meet people while talking to them. So in London, there is Bobo's Cafe. But while I was working in there one of the weeks, I just saw two groups of school children just coming in, just bringing a random drink and a meal deal into the store. No one chased them out. They just hung out there. And I thought that was the loveliest thing I've ever seen, especially in a place where, in like London, where you have to buy a drink to use the toilet. You have to buy a drink to sit down. So seeing that was really heartwarming.
This is Liz Tan, WGSN Senior Cultural Strategist, and my guest on this episode of Lives of Tomorrow. So today we're talking about the Regression Generation, and this is a new label that's been given to Gen Z and Alphas who will come of age while also going backwards or regressing in society. Now, if that sounds kind of sad, it probably is, but there is hope, especially if parents, businesses, and the social media industry ramp up resources to help this generation. And we're going to discuss all of that today. I'm Carla Buzasi. I'm the CEO of WGSN, the world's leading trend forecasting company, and you're listening to Lives of Tomorrow. So let's get back to Liz. Liz, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm Liz Tan, a senior culture strategist on WGSN Insight. So I write a lot about youth culture, and I also write the marketing content.
Okay, amazing. Now, we have got a really specific topic that we're talking about today, which is off the back of a forecast that you wrote and we published at WGSN earlier this year. So the forecast was called the Regression Generation, and in it you wrote that Gen Z and Alphas are coming of age while regressing in society. So what do you mean by that? How are they regressing?
Okay, I want to just start off by saying that Regression Generation sounds very negative, but I promise you there are positives to this entire conversation. So when we talk about the Regression Generation, we're talking about these two cohorts who have been growing up amidst so much chaos during the pandemic. Their social growth, educational growth is being impacted. So this means that they're not maturing at the same rate as previous generations. And that's also impacting how they live their life and how they come of age in the next few years. So when I first wrote The Regression Generation, I was trying to encapsulate how Gen Z and Alpha are growing up amidst so much chaos that it's becoming very hard for them to progress in life and in society, in their social life, in education, because there's so much stress and, this like financial burden that's becoming harder and harder for them to gain access to better education, better living standards. So that's all impacting their growth. And for example, a lot of it is also inspired by what's happening on TikTok and social media. So even though we know that social media are tools for us to stay connected with other people, they've also become platforms where you can learn about not so great habits. One thing in particular I want to highlight, which I think is crazy, is how on TikTok you can learn how to shoplift. But obviously it's not being called shoplifting on TikTok. It's called borrowing. So you borrow. So if you search borrow on TikTok, you will find content about how young people are showcasing their borrowing hauls, how to shoplift items, how to go into, places like Target or Walmart and teach you on how to get away with it.
So let's talk about the other aspect here, which is more the kind of behavioural one, because I think that's really interesting. So if you look at this regression through that lens, what are the behaviours that you're seeing and you're forecasting to increase in future years?
Behavioral wise, a big change that we're seeing is like this confidence crisis. So they're really struggling to learn social skills because the pandemic has such an impact on like their growth and development. Both generations, both Gen Z and Alpha, are actually struggling with literacy rates. So I'm going to start with Gen Alpha because, Gen Z, they're coping with it, they're learning, They are hooked on Duolingo. But with Gen Alpha, they're struggling to learn how to read because of the amount of video content that's out there. And in the US, 37% of like fourth grade students and 38% of eighth grade students scored below the proficiency level, like the basic proficiency level for reading in 2022. That's pretty scary because what are you going to do if you can't read? It's similar in the UK. The kids' reading habits have been declining since 2005. So yeah, I think that's a big gap that we need to fill. Like, how do we get people to read?
Okay, so when you talk about regression, explain to me exactly what is the regression there. So we've talked about maybe behaviors and the impact, but how does that manifest?
They're different from just like, let's take the home setting, for example. You have boomerang kids who are on the rise, and boomerang kids are children returning home to live with their parents. This is in previous generations, they leave their home to go to university. And then from there, they start renting their own apartments because they go into the first time jobs and everything. But now it's getting harder and harder to like, the rental market itself is becoming too expensive. They have to pay off student debt. They have to work part-time jobs. So boomerang kids now living with their parents is just like a big shift, especially within Eurocentric like societies, because we have that in Asia and that's quite common. But we're seeing lots of benefits at the same time, even though people are like, oh, like my kids are moving back home. Some people don't agree with it. And I know some children don't like it because their freedom is being affected. But at the same time, some Gen Zs appreciate being back home. We talk so much about them being lonely. Being back home, you have the comfort of being with your parents, your siblings, and sometimes even your grandparents.
But is it essentially what we're saying then is they're just not growing up? They're not growing up at the rates that other people and other generations have done, and the responsibilities that would come with that coming of age, I guess. They're behaving at 20 like a 15-year-old would have done in previous generations.
I want to say yes and no, because I feel like they are growing up quite quickly in terms of, the content that they consume online. They're maturing a lot quicker, but then their lifestyles are not as mature as how they're maturing mentally.
Okay. Let's zero in on the loneliness aspect, because that's, we're trying to do the kind of positives and negatives of that. That sounds exceptionally negative. So this generation, I think you quoted in your forecast that 44% of 12 to 21-year-olds in the UK say they feel lonely almost all of the time. So where's that come from, and what impact does that have?
This loneliness epidemic is an ongoing conversation. I think it's a conversation that you and I will be having in the next few years as well. It's not something that's going to go away. It's impacting Gen Z in many different areas. And I think the main reason why they feel lonely is social media again. So while we see many benefits, it brings us together, it helps us stay connected. It also impacts young people's ability to communicate and connect with people in real life. Because, when you just send someone a DM or commenting on a post and, you comment back, send a tweet, reply to one, it's just through a screen. You're using a keyboard. You find conversations do flow easily. But then when you try and replicate that in real life social setting, it doesn't really happen the same way for this generation. Many of them struggle with social anxiety because they were hindered of those experiences in their formative years. The pandemic in the best case lasted 2 years, some countries 3. So that really dampened their social ability and skills. Another reason why they are lonely is also migration patterns. Now that we're becoming more of a global, everything is acting more of a global scale. You have travel that's back in full swing. You see lots more of young migrants. And actually they make up 10% of the 232 million international migrants all over the world. And that's quite a big number of them. So these new travel and migration patterns can increase the loneliness epidemic because they start forming long distance friendships and fleeting relationships wherever they go.
I think it's very reflected in the conversation actually I had with a mother whose daughter was 16 or is 16, and she was saying how shy she was and very much felt it was because at the age that she would have learned those social skills, becoming a teenager, she was deprived of all of that because she was locked down. And so she finds it much easier to communicate with people online because that's what she did for 2, to your point, nearly 3 years. And now she's older and the world has opened up. She doesn't have the confidence to go out there. So I think whereas some of these aspects aren't necessarily pandemic related, I can see that the loneliness one absolutely is. And the problem is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because people aren't getting out and speaking to people. They don't do it. They lose their confidence and then they don't want to do it. So they never make those connections. And I can definitely see the long-term aspects of that being negative for society as a whole, because we learn from our parents. And as this generation matures, hopefully does meet people, reproduces in some shape or form, they are going to be bringing up children like them. And when are you going to get this kind of injection of confidence and positivity? I'm really interested in if your formative years are spent like this, where your interaction is online, you're not seeing people, what happens when you do go out into the real wide world? So what behaviors are we seeing there?
I think those who are going out into the real world are the cohort that are willing to take action and make that change. You know, they're slowly gaining momentum. They are seeking out experiences from brands or like products that help them connect with other people and lead them to community. I think it's very difficult for us to have a conversation about Gen Z and Alpha without talking about the community aspect. I think that's something that they crave so much, and that's why gaming is their favorite thing to do. It's their favorite hobby. You get to meet people while talking to them. And I think there are so many places around the world that are trying to push and provide these experiences. So in London, there is Bobo's Cafe. It's very cute. I highly recommend anyone to go. You can go there during the day, bring your laptop, sit down, have a coffee and work. But while I was working in there one of the weeks, I just saw 2 groups of school children just coming in, just bringing a random drink and a meal deal into the store. No one chased them out. They just hung out there. And I thought that was the loveliest thing I've ever seen, especially in a place where, in like London, where you have to buy a drink to use the toilet. You have to buy a drink to sit down. So seeing that was really heartwarming.
It's definitely an opportunity. It's something we talk about in Future Consumer 2026, which is the return of these in real life spaces and the need for them because so many places closed down during the pandemic. And we're still seeing that. Again, I'm focusing on the UK because that's where I'm sitting today, but the number of pubs and bars and, you know, still closing at huge rates. And those sort of traditional meeting places haven't been replaced. But certainly our forecasting and our recommendations is creating spaces where people, like-minded people, can get together. And there are brilliant examples of that. So I was in Dubai with work last week, and there's a place called Cassette, which is bringing music lovers together. There's the Panasonic Cafe in Japan, which is exactly the same. I mean, ultimately, they're hoping that they're going to sell you more Technics, but music lovers are brought together, beautiful space, and like-minded musicians also playing. And I think the ability for brands now to create those spaces and create a meaningful connection with consumers is really interesting. Now, we're going to come back to how society, how everyone can kind of help with this. But first of all, I want to get to know you a little bit better. And this is always really illuminating when I do this podcast with people who work at WGSN. So I'm going to ask you some questions, whatever comes into your head. First of all, quick fire responses.
Okay.
Who do you look up to and why?
Wow, this is a very good question, Carla. I feel like I never used the term looking up to anyone. I think I do admire people. I don't look up to anyone in particular because I think I always try and surround myself with people who uplift me and those around them.
Okay, a slightly different question. When did you last give up on something?
Well, at the start of every year, actually, I started incorporating a list called how many years old I am that time. So this year I'm 26, so it was 26 by 26. I try and write 26 things. And one of them is trying to reach the 10K mark with running outside. I struggle a lot with running outside, especially living in London when the seasons change. I've kind of given up on the 10K mark at this point because I have struggled to get back into running. I realized that I don't actually enjoy it.
That's fair enough. I do love running, but I can totally see you've got to find something you really, really enjoy, or you've got to find some really good music. That's that. Or podcast. That's my other thing. I run to podcasts. Okay. What do you rarely share about yourself?
Okay, fun fact. Not many people at work know this about me, but I used to play rugby.
Really?
And not like touch rug, like actual
like
rugby.
Proper tackling, the full works.
The full works.
That is fascinating. Okay, well, I'll give you something back on that front. My first birthday present was a cricket bat and ball because my dad is super into sport and was like, well, I don't care if I had a girl, I'm like training them early. They can play every sport going. So I played cricket. I mean, I did literally every sport as a child because that was my father and he loved it. And so was determined we were all going to be good at something. Okay, which main trend do you see right now that is fundamentally changing our lives?
I like this question a lot, and I would draw something from the Trends Days presentation I just did. So like for context, Trends Day is our internal conference where all of us forecasters, we just nerd out and talk about the future. It's my favorite time of the year, actually. In one of our 2026 forecasts, we talk about old answers to new questions, and I think that plays into it. And when I was at South by Southwest this year, a lot of like the industry leaders themselves has started to take stock and apply that approach of, you have themes like recontextualizing censorship, you have rewriting creativity. It's all about how can we look at things from a different lens.
Final question. When are you satisfied with yourself?
I'm the most satisfied when I've had time to cook for my loved ones. I think my culture is so much about food being a love language, and cooking is meditation for me. I know running is meditation for some.
When you say your culture, what is your background for people who don't know you, who are just listening to this podcast? So where is that culture of cooking as a love language coming from?
My culture, I'm from Singapore and I'm Peranakan, which is straight-born Chinese. I am half Malay and half Chinese. Then in that culture, we have this one meal called tok panjang, which is a long table. That's just what it means. You just have everyone over.
Loads of food and loads of people. Okay, let's go back to the topic in hand, because you are the expert on this. So as we look to the future, what can society, what can brands, what can businesses do to help these generations mature? How can we stop them regressing? How can we step in? And I guess which aspect of those, family, society, businesses, brands, which are the ones which are going to be able to have the most positive impact?
I mean, parents will have the most impact in terms of being at home, but then you need to realize that, everyone's working busy with their lives, and with them being so much on social media, brands have an even bigger role to play. And one of them is about helping them feel less lonely. So I always tell our clients that you have to assume the role of a matchmaker. Like you never think of a brand as a matchmaker, but now everything is changing, and they need to learn how to create experiences that connect with consumers, both like in the digital and physical world. I think it's very unrealistic to say that they are gonna stop using social media or stop gaming completely. So it's about creating safer spaces for them to build community, to find the community. One of my favorite examples is this restaurant in Singapore. Carla, you should go when you head there. It's called Middle Child Wine Bar. They bring in lots of amazing wines. And
okay, you've got me already. I don't need to know anything else. There's wine involved in there.
And it's very central location as well. The space is very cozy. But they have this event called Meet Me in the Middle. And it lets friends pitch their single friends to them in the room. So you sign up, you have a PowerPoint presentation party, and everyone giving reasons why they would be good for people. So some people list out their green flags and their red flags, and I can't wait to go back home just to go to one of these parties. I just want to know what people are saying about their friends.
Wow. There's something quite nice about that when we've just got used to the fact that dating apps are the way that people meet now. That's just the default. It's not a new thing. This is how people meet each other. And so a sort of reversal, but done in a modern way, which is meeting people in real life, but in a way that feels very supportive and no one has to put themselves out there by themselves. There's something really neat in that. I haven't heard of that anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I think Singapore is such a small place where you need someone to be your right-hand man, right-hand woman, just pitch your friend. Another cool app that recently launched is called the Breakfast app. So it allows global creatives to meet each other over breakfast. So it's just about creating this network and exchanging information. It's all across cities from New York to Barcelona to even like Tbilisi in Georgia. So I think that's a great way to just connect people.
And do they meet in person? They connect on the app and then meet in person?
Yeah, and it's strictly for just networking or meeting someone new in the city when you're traveling. So the dating bit is just out the window, and this is strictly professional. So
let's zero in on the parents for a second. So what should parents be doing to help these generations?
I think that they have a part to play in terms of creating those conversations, and parents need to come together. So as much as we talk about communities for young people, parents need their own communities and their support groups to troubleshoot some of these social development issues or raise awareness about if someone is not treating someone right in class, or maybe that shoplifting thing is happening to somebody that they know. But it's all about, hey, how can we come together, have these conversations and make parents feel less alone dealing with these issues. And I think a lot of time there's a lot of shame behind children misbehaving. When we were kids, we're doing the same things. We're misbehaving in different ways, but maybe it's not learning how to shoplift on TikTok. But
yeah, but it's interesting, I guess, then the solution for the younger, so the regression generation, the solution for them is shared spaces. It's bringing people together in real life. It's community. And actually for the parents to be able to lead by example, they need it as well. What can we do to prevent this happening in the future? So the generation coming up behind alphas, how do we kind of course correct from where we are now?
I think the course correcting comes a lot from just having open conversations and like sharing about these situations that are currently happening. But in terms of what brands can do, they just need to help build these spaces for people to come together and talk. I think a lot of them it just stems from that loneliness aspect, not having a support system. Part of me, I'm hopeful that this actually wouldn't happen again in the future, because for the next generation, you have Gen Z parents coming along, and they would hopefully learn from their experiences and not impart these same situations onto them or same habits. And I think, more hopeful than anything that other generations won't be faced with the same problems.
What can the social media firms do? And I did notice in my Instagram feed this weekend, the new teen accounts. Now, we've heard them being talked about for ages, but I actually saw it in my feed as in a kind of prompt this weekend. But what are social media firms going to have to do? And gaming firms as well, I would say.
They definitely have to hone in on social media care initiatives. I think, them learning about the care economy has an even bigger role to play than brands at this point, because that's their information point. That's where young people are learning a lot of things. Gaming and social media companies will need to have more features in place to verify ages, to train AI technology to better detect certain key terms. We talk so much about AI helping, like creatives and everything. What about AI for safety? I think there's a big gap in the market, not having the right features currently to monitor chat rooms, to monitor the hashtags that come onto TikTok. But if it's not, because you have borrowing content that is not shoplifting, you have borrowing where you're learning how to do something else or just borrow from other people. Yeah, and I think it's just having those in place. AI for safety is a big thing.
Yeah, AI for safety. That's look, we haven't talked about that. I'm sure there's a whole nother podcast in that as a topic, but I believe in AI for good, and AI for safety is a segment of that, I would argue. and definitely something that probably should be explored more. But yeah, I mean, it also comes back to the why we teaching AI to create art when actually AI to do things like make, our younger generation safer and happier would be a much better use of that, and let the artists continue to create beautiful art. Again, that's probably another topic or another rant for another day that we could get onto. Just, I guess, maybe sort of coming towards the end of this, why should brands help this generation or these two generations? Why? What's in it for them?
It's about playing the long game with Gen Z and Gen Alpha. As a brand, you want to make sure that you establish that emotional connection before all else. And your brand needs to show up where it matters most to them. So even if it's just creating an ongoing event for a niche community or creating a store that doesn't aim to drive sales, but just provide that social connection, serve as a hub for young people. Brands who can get there first will reap the true customer loyalty. I think it's just about showing up as a friend. Brands should think themselves as have it, that human persona, create those connections. A big takeaway would be to be very calculated and intentional about where you show up for your fans, especially when you have so much happening on the internet. It's just so much noise out there. So yeah, I think brands will need to step up in that area.
And finally, are you more anxious or hopeful for the future of the regression generation?
Well, in the education aspect, I am anxious about how they would progress. But as a whole, I am quite hopeful. I think they have resources given to them. And now that we're seeing more initiatives and Gen Z wanting to step out of their homes, that's such a big deal already. I am hopeful that this generation will step out of their box. They just need more time.
A really big thank you to Liz Tan, Insight Strategist here at WGSN. If you're interested in reading more about the regression generation and importantly, what can be done to help them, please reach out to lives@wgsn.com. My name's Carla Buzasi and I'll be back with a new episode in 14 days. In the meantime, please catch up on our other podcast, Create Tomorrow, where we're talking about trends in holiday gifting. Yep, it really is that time of year. I'll see you next time.